name of God, I will be at your service for this third series or episode of the Fact, the series that we have concerning international issues. I would like to welcome both of our respected guests, Mr. Gearóid Colmáin from France and also Ali Musawi from Baghdad. Uh, I would like to start with Mr. Colmáin. As you know, recently Trump has put IRGC on the on terrorist list, and that is just something that actually shocked so many people. I would like to know about the reason of such a decision.
It was always inevitable that this was going to happen. I mean, the Trump regime is under the control of the neocons. The neocons are essentially Jewish conservatives. They are all Israeli firsters, and they want to destroy the last real enemy of the Zionist state in the Middle East, which is Iran. For various reasons, for geopolitical reasons in particular, to continue the territorial expansion of the Zionist state in the Middle East, but also because of the civilizational threat it poses to globalization on a number of issues that are important to the Israelis. For example, the promotion of the type of Islam that Iran is involved in is antithetical to what they're promoting in the world, which is Wahhabism, spreading death squads throughout Syria, waging war against Yemen. Iran's role in the peace process, for example, in Syria, in bringing peace and winning the war, has been instrumental and has been very important. So Iran has been a huge obstacle to Israeli ambitions, geopolitical ambitions, and also the message of the Islamic Revolution, the message of liberation, of Palestinian liberation, and so on, is a continuous threat to Israel. So the Trump regime is playing up to Israeli pressure because the Israelis control American foreign policy, whether it is Democrats or the Republicans in power. You have the Israeli power nexus, which controls the State Department, it controls the Council of Foreign Relations, controls most of the intelligence apparatus in the United States, and the media, which is probably the most important department to control, because the media controls how people perceive the world. So I think the possible threat right now is an attack, a false flag attack in the United States or in Europe, blamed on Iran. You know, you have the demonization, the delegitimization of the Iranian armed forces, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, equating Iran again with terrorism. If you had, for example, a terrorist attack in Europe or America blamed on Iran, that would be a pretext for a war. A war with Iran would essentially be not just a regional war, but it would inevitably be a world war, because it would draw the entire region in. It would involve Russia. It would involve China, because their energy interests and geopolitical interests would be affected by it. So it would be a world war. America cannot win that kind of a war, but the Israelis don't really care about America. America is a stepping stone to their messianic ambitions, which is a creation of a world government under their control. We shouldn't underestimate the madness of the Zionists. They are mad, and they are fanatical. I think one problem of that kind of an operation, if they were to go, further and organize a false flag terrorist attack and blame it on Iran, is that it would be hard to convince people now that Iran would do something like that. It's very implausible, particularly in Europe, because people are more aware of what Iran is. People, studied the country. It doesn't seem plausible that a country like Iran, a government like Iran, would engage in that kind of activity. What interest would it serve? But having said that, the media can make people believe anything, and that has always been a possibility. We should also recall that even past National Security Advisor of the United States, Zbigniew Brzezinski, mentioned himself that was a possibility, a false flag, a terrorist attack in the United States blamed in Iran as a casus belli. So when you have people of that level, former National Security Advisors, saying that essentially the neocons could pull off a false flag terrorist attack and blame it on Iran, we should be aware of that possibility. Also, of course, you have previous attempts to persuade the U.S. government to engage to create false flag terrorist attacks. So that's something definitely that people should be aware of as a possibility.
Okay, so I would like to jump in here and ask Musawi about the outcomes that such a move will have in international law. Do you think that such a move or this inclusion on terrorist list would be against any kind of international law or not?
Well, this is actually the move by the U.S. State Department to designate the Iranian Islamic Revolution God's Corps as on its terror list is unprecedented. It has not been done before that a country would place a legitimate military of a sovereign state, of a sovereign country, on its terror list. That has not been done before. This is the first of its kind. So there is nothing in terms of international law that would prevent it. Now, this will be discussed whether there will be dealing with this within the international context. What we have seen, even close allies of the United States, simply outright rejected that move by Washington, including Japan and many other countries. They rejected such a move because once the United States, it is the most powerful country on this planet, does that to Iran, to the army, to the military that defends the Iranian sovereignty and the Iranian people, it will do the same with other countries. So basically, anyone that opposes American policies that does not conform to American interests and policies will be added to that list. Any country, the military, the army of that country, and in that case, for them, it become a legitimate target to attack. But in terms of international law, no, there isn't. However, the reaction we have seen, although it's not as strong as it should be, because this is a huge American threat. This is bypassing the UN Security Council, bypassing the UN itself, with all its members, which is the majority of countries on this planet, and it's basically discarding any norms, any kind of international norms, to simply add a military of another country to its list, to its terror list. Will this become, from what we heard the U.S. Secretary of State Pompeo saying when he made the announcement, is that his main aim is to prevent anyone from trading with Iran. He claimed that the IRGC control 50% of the Iranian economy. Now, he didn't say how much this will harm the Iranian economy if they do target legitimate businesses that are controlled by the IRGC, but he didn't say that how this will harm the average Iranian citizen. But he said he's willing to go through with that. But from what he's been saying is that he's trying to make the IRGC look like Daesh. And he was quoted as saying that he wanted people to view Qasem Soleimani similar to they view Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So that's how far America is willing to go to try and ignore any kind of international norms and international diplomacy, especially with Donald Trump as president, who's almost clueless when it comes to diplomacy and how countries deal with each other. It's only within that kind of rather ridiculous attempt by Trump to try and win something. We've seen the sanctions have done nothing against Iran. They were unilateral again and rejected by the majority of people in the world. And this adding the IRGC on the U.S. terror list is similar, and it will bear similar fruits. Almost nothing. It will harm the people. It will show America being strong, but it will not have the end result that America wants.
I would like to know about this double standard approach that U.S. Has chosen these days, or not only these days, but also so many years so far. Because you have seen this called MKO or MEK, as was said in some different websites, that this group was actually excluded from the list of terrorists, and also you can see Saudi Arabia just attacking Yemeni people and doing lots of actually tyranny, and you can also see Israel just doing whatever he wants or it wants against Palestinians. But whenever it comes to Hezbollah or IRGC, suddenly these groups are considered as terrorists. So, Gearóid, why do you think such a move would happen and such a double standard would be chosen from U.S.?
Well, the double standard is very simple. Anybody who is an opponent of U.S.-Israeli interests is a terrorist, and it's as simple as that, really. A terrorist essentially is someone the U.S. government considers to be an obstacle or a potential military intelligence asset. Okay, there are no real enemies of the United States that can be described as terrorists. There are simply rivals, power rivals like Russia, China, Iran to a certain extent. Iran more in terms of its opposition, I think, to Israel, which is why the focus has been more on Iran since Trump took power. The double standard is the norm of international relations from the Western side. It isn't the norm on the other side. I mean, the Chinese are fairly consistent in the way they deal with other countries. Usually it just sort of it's based on trade relations, and they tend to follow international law in terms of their diplomacy. The Russians likewise. They're pretty conservative in terms of their interpretation of international law. They abide by the rules by and large. They don't send mercenary forces into countries to take them over, overthrow them. They have, by and large, a defensive position geopolitically. The Americans, the Mujahideen al-Khalq, you mentioned them. They're being trained in Albania. They have a base there, and they have huge support, of course, from the Bondsteel base in Kosovo, which was the biggest U.S. military base in Europe, where the U.S. essentially sent in terrorists to take over the country, then created a military base. It's a narco-state run by the U.S. military. The Mujahideen al-Khalq have a base there now and in Albania, and they're an army which is being trained and funded by the US to invade Iran like they did before under Saddam Hussein. That failed miserably, but I guess they're hoping that they'll be more successful next time. So, you know, people need to understand that there is no such thing as a war on terrorism. Terrorism is an instrument of imperialism, and anyone who, you know, you guys in the Middle East who live in Iraq and Iran know that better than anyone else, because you see it every day. The kind of terrorist attacks that hit us here in the West are minuscule. You know, Paris got hit a couple of times. Everybody was talking about it. Nothing much really happened. It was more media than reality. Nobody even knows what happened, but all the newspapers and all the TV stations were talking about, you know, the minuscule terrorist attacks that happened. Terrorism is really virtual nowadays, and it's more about creating fear, creating a state of tension, and then designating an enemy. But you know, when you study these terrorist attacks, you usually find that the guys who are supposed to, you know, be carrying them out would not be capable of organising a tea party on their own. You know, they're usually pot-smoking youth who've never really been involved in anything serious in their lives, perhaps maybe other than informing for the secret services or something like that, or petty crime, but not sophisticated kind of guys capable of bringing down, you know, the Twin or blowing up Washington or Paris. So people need to realize that most terrorism in the world is committed by Western intelligence agencies. And the big problem in the West is that people are lulled into consensus. You know, they have huge problem accepting the idea that the people running Western society are really that immoral, really that mad, because they don't I guess life in the West is quite calm and comfortable. People cannot possibly imagine that, you know, their leaders would be complicit in things like terrorism. It's because of just the sheer sophistication of the propaganda. You know, the people if they watch mainstream media all the time, it's so well presented. And then you have an entire intelligentsia. You know, you have the most sophisticated intelligentsia in the world. All these experts, all these academics, all these professor this and professor that, and PhD this and PhD that, and none of them talk about the elephant in the room, which is false flag terrorism. Those who have at that level are ostracized. You know, I could talk about Daniele Ganser, I think, was the only PhD candidate in Europe at the time who was writing about Operation Gladio, and he did his thesis on that, but it was the only one. And this was in terrorist operations that were taking place all over Europe for more than a decade, and it was admitted by the European Union, it was admitted by the European Parliament, it was admitted by the President of Italy. It's not a theory, it's not a conspiracy theory, and yet nobody seems to know about it. There's no funding going. We should have dozens of doctoral studies now on Operation Gladio, but you know, you're not allowed to talk about these things. So the problem with that is that more or less what the war on terrorism is about, which is the reason why they want to crack down on the internet. The censorship right now in the West is astronomical. Pages are being automatically deleted as soon as any kind of content that bothers the authorities turns up, and you have criminalization.
European countries, I would like to, because our next question is basically about the reaction that other countries had against this decision, because obviously European countries normally they have always just tried to have the same side that US had against or concerning Iran, but in this time, except Israel or Saudi Arabia, most of these countries were somehow against this decision of Trump, and they were against the inclusion of IRGC on this list. So I would like to know Mr. Musawi's take about this issue. Why do you think such countries that would that normally are against Iran would be against such a decision?
Well, most of these countries who are allied with the U.S. are not allied because they are friends or anything like that. They're allied with the U.S. because they are forced to be with the U.S. The U.S. is a powerful country. It's a bully. They have bullied their way for the past since World War II against smaller countries. So most countries have always sided with the U.S. because it's less headache, it's less pressure. We do remember that in 2002, when America was planning the attack against Iraq, what we saw is that France was the only one who opposed that move at the time. They even opposed in the UN Security Council, and they were demonized for years by the US administration as well as the US media, and that did harm France. So countries are afraid of opposing the US. However, with this specific move by the US is designating a military of a country, a legitimate military, and an army that defends the sovereignty of that country, that upholds its laws and its constitution, onto its terrorist list, goes way beyond any kind of international norms, any kind of laws that countries deal with each other with. So that move by the U.S. has scared people more than they have of being opposed to the U.S. Because today it's the IRGC, tomorrow will be let's just say hypothetically the French army or the Iraqi army for not following, not obeying U.S. commands or U.S. demands of Iraq, for example, cutting off its trade ties with the Islamic Republic, or even treating the IRGC as terrorists. So that could easily be done because right now Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are on the terror list. We have seen this similar scenarios with Lebanese legitimate resistance, Hezbollah, where they were added to terror list, and anyone who deals with them are threatened. They are threatened with jail. They are threatened with losing their businesses, losing their livelihood. So this is what we've been seeing over the years, and the majority of countries who have spoke out and immediately spoke out against the US's move, it's mainly because it simply does not conform to any kind of international norms that exist between countries. And given that America, this such power, terrifies most countries in the world. We have seen that Venezuela have, over the past few months, have been fighting really hard to prevent any kind of American invasion on the pretense of bringing democracy to Venezuela. We have seen them how they've done that. We have seen what America have done to various countries which they came in under many false pretenses. For example, Iraq, where I'm located right now, is one of those countries who have suffered for over a decade, not just that, over 2 decades, sanctions and wars and terrorism because of US policies. Now designating an army that's there to defend a country's sovereignty against the only, such as in Venezuela, is something that every country in this world should take notice. Not just those who have a powerful army who can, let's just say, put up a good defense against any kind of US aggression, but even smaller ones who simply have no way of defending their countries if the US decided to invade. So yeah, it is something that's big, and this rejection by, I would say, the international community is the proof that this specific American administration simply does not understand what international law is, does not understand international diplomacy. And they are simply just going by the whims of their erratic president, who one day he decides he wants to sanction a country, the next day he wants to wage a war. So such criticism and such rejection of the move has to increase by various countries in order to show the Trump administration, and if not the Trump administration, at least influential U.S. politicians and corporate leaders, that this move is simply not accepted by the international community, and we will basically stand against it. Only then, if such pressure, will the U.S. I say backtrack on such a move, although it's unlikely under Trump's administration for any kind of diplomacy to win. But the international community has to try to prevent major calamities from taking place, because right now we have the U.S. military. It's already in Iraq. It has bases in Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. So it's only as well as Bahrain. So their military ships are they sail meters away from Iranian borders. Anything could happen. Any such action, the U.S. would say, "Oh, it's a terrorist threat," and they will attack, or so on. This could ignite a major war in the region that would have severe repercussion across the world. This is what that Trump
mentioned. Yes, yeah. You mentioned the very interesting point about the region, that it might actually make some war or some other kind of conflict in this region. But if you want to go into details, Mr. Colmáin, do you think this kind of decision will have a real effect either on Iran or on the region?
Well, Iran is obviously under pressure with these sanctions already. I mean, the screw is certainly tightening here in France as well, even though they're against this recent measure with basically effectively the criminalization of the Iranian state and the army. Nevertheless, the French government are pursuing legislation banning any kind of Islamist, in inverted commas, organization other than the Salafis, other than the organizations supported by their friends in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So the Salafist, the Islamist organizations they're trying to ban in France are essentially organizations, Shia organizations, fighting against terrorism. So this is where we're at, and it's unsurprising. There's an attempt to delegitimize Iran, to demonize it. The Europeans obviously haven't gone as far as America has at this stage. An interesting thing that's sort of happening, and it has been happening since Trump took power, is that there's a division in the world Jewish community vis-a-vis Israel. So it's a complex contradiction, because you have the liberal Jews. The liberal Jews don't like Trump, and that's about 80% of the Jews in the United States. They don't like Trump because he's anti-liberal. And liberalism, I suppose, is more Jewish than conservatism, which is why when the Jews took over the conservative movement in the United States, they call it neoconservatism, which really means Jewish conservatism, which is actually not conservatism at all. So there is this ideological conflict that's going on in the United States. This internal civil war is deeply complex, because there's much more than geopolitics involved. For example, we don't know what Trump's peace plan for the Middle East is. I hear that it very much depends on Netanyahu staying in place, and I don't know what that means, because if you read the Israeli press, they don't want any peace plan. They don't even want any talk of a peace plan. So and yet there seems to be this peace plan, by Jared Kushner. So what is Kushner's role in this? I mean, where do the Americans see this going? It's very hard to say. Trump, for his first election, kind of went on an anti-war ticket, and Steve Bannon, his chief strategist, is has criticised the neoconservative wars. Now, he hasn't criticised Israel, but everybody knows who the neoconservatives are. So it's unclear what the long-term endgame here is. I would find it very hard to see. Well, but put it this way: if the Americans get into war with Iran, it's a war, and there's no winner there, really. So that would, and I don't see that happening before before the election, before the presidential election, because Trump can't go into the presidential election and say, "Hey, I've just got us into another unwinnable war with American troops coming home in like Iraq." So he's got to come in. I think he's going to try and present himself as some kind of a peacemaker, you know, Augustus Caesar. I sorted out the Middle East. I sorted out North Korea. What he's doing in Iran and Venezuela right now is the opposite. So, and there are, you know, two. I mean, Venezuela could explode into a huge regional war, as of course Iran, which would, you know, it all depends on, you know, determine what happens, even, you know, regardless of what Trump is trying to actually do. But I think that the division in the international Jewish community here is interesting, because what you have on the one hand is Israel is now probably more unpopular than ever before, because the liberal Jews are not very comfortable with this idea of an overtly aggressive colonialist regime which just you know, guns down kids. It's becoming impossible to market Israel as being anything progressive among the Jewish community. So they are kind of trying to distance themselves, but also they're, because of what Trump represents, what he represents on a kind of a philosophical level is the opposite of what they stand for, which is liberalism. So that even though Trump is an ultra-Zionist, about 80% of American Jews are against Trump, and yet he has very powerful Zionists supporting him. You know, Sheldon Adelman, you know, Paul Singer contributed. Paul Singer, I don't think supported him. I mean, it was Paul Singer who started the Russian campaign against Trump, the idea of the Russian interference. And there's a huge conflict between him now and Steve Bannon. But Singer eventually sort of gave money, and so it's still complex. Like, we don't know. I mean, for a long time we thought, you know, Trump was going to be overthrown. Now he seems to have emerged triumphant out of that. But I don't see how he could sell a war with Iran and then win the election. It just would be suicide. How could you present that as some kind of achievement, you know?
Here I would like to jump in here to see your honest, actually the opinion of both of you. I would like to know if any movement that happened from Iran or from explicitly from IRGC was either positive or negative in the region, either in Syria or in Iraq or any other country that might have been involved. I would like to know if the existence or the presence of IRGC in the region was eventually positive or negative, because some say that this thing that happened to IRGC was something that was somehow some comeback from whatever IRGC was doing itself in the region. So I would like to start with Mr. Musawi, and then I will get back to Mr. Colmáin about the same question. So what is your take about this?
A reaction to the presence of the IRGC in the region, its action in the region, its policies, what the Revolutionary Guard have done is they not only supported forces that are opposed to American interests in the region, mainly the presence of the Israeli regime. They have also empowered resistance groups to not only be just a military or a militia that holds arms against a foreign entity or to preserve their dignity or to support the oppressed people of a nation. These militias have grown into a political force, a social that has a huge social network that supports people. I could talk from personal experiences in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. I've lived in those three countries over the past 35 years of my life, and I could tell you that. For example, in Lebanon was a war zone. For decades, Lebanon was a war zone, was not a place to go to. The only thing that have come up positive out of that long civil war in Lebanon, as well as the Israeli occupation of Lebanon, is the Islamic resistance, Hizbullah. Their existence, they were created because of the Israeli invasion itself. And they were supported, backed, and created by the IRGC. And Hezbollah, what we see they are today, not only have they have defeated the occupiers, the Israeli occupiers, in 2000 and liberated the country. They've also defeated them in a direct war. The first well-documented loss for the so-called back then the invincible Israeli army. So that shows that Hezbollah, with its limited resources of weapons and fighters at the time, managed to defeat the most powerful, according to them, of course, army in the region, and fought it to a standstill in 2006. And we could go beyond that. Hezbollah have become a regional player. Fighting against the presence of Daesh, which was a threat to the whole world. Hezbollah was leading that war on the battlefield. They led many fronts in Syria. They've helped Iraq in fighting against Daesh. Now that's for Lebanon. For Syria, in Syria, for example, Syria was a very stable country until America and its allies, especially the Gulf allies, including Turkey, decided to meddle. Once they meddled, the whole terrorism of Daesh, as well as Jabhat al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda, and many, many more, were created. This caused violence that we have never seen before. Anywhere, in any conflict, in any civil war, we have not seen this level of violence we saw in Syria during that time. And yes, the IRGC supported the legitimate Syrian government, supported Syria, and if you go now to any area that was liberated by the Syrian army, also with the support of its allies, you would see that these areas are stable, life is returning to normal, and any destruction has been removed and rebuilding is in the process. And Syria is not exactly a rich country to be able to build itself yet. It's managing to do that thanks to the support of the IRGC. So this is itself is a hugely positive. Syria, which is a secular state, secular, not very. They have allowed religion, but they are a secular state. Most Syrians are very happy with what Iran has done, with the support of Iran, with the Islamic Republic. So you can see that even a secular state such as Syria saw the positive role Iran has played, and they have a very positive view of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Now, if you go to Iraq went through hell, whether it was during Saddam's rule, where he managed to launch a devastating war against Iran, as well as try to occupy Kuwait, and there was sanctions against the people of Iraq. Many starved to death. The people suffered a lot. On top of that, he was a brutal dictator at home, and not only did he use chemical weapons, but he was very creative in torturing his people. His torture is well documented in the country. And skip forward to the US occupation, and then the bombing campaign across Baghdad. We used to hear 10, 20 car bombs, suicide bombs across Baghdad and other cities. And this was all America's doing, America and its allies. In return, in 2000, we saw that in 2003, Iran played a role in Iraq, tried to aid the Iraqi resistance movement against the U.S. occupation, and yes, that was very positive for Iraqis. Iraq had almost sovereignty when the U.S. left in 2011, but then came Daesh. We see exactly what Iran did. The Popular Mobilization Forces, or Hashd al-Sha'bi, became the most powerful military force in Iraq, and this largely thanks to the religious edict of Ayatollah Sayyid Sistani in Iraq and the full backing of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Their support, powerful army that terrifies. Not only did they win the war against Daesh in many areas in Iraq, they also terrified neighboring countries, forced them to change their policies, such as Saudi Arabia, where now Saudi Arabia trying to have to normalize ties, try to be friendly with Iraq compared to what was before, where it was responsible for sending thousands of suicide bombers to the country. The role that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps played has been huge in the region, and in every one of those scenarios I've mentioned, the role have been positive on the ground and positive for the people there in those countries.